Hey everyone, welcome to the Codeigniter application series. The first thing we're going to want to understand is what is MVC. MVC stands for Model View Controller. And what I'm going to do is give you a demonstration with pictures on how it works, and I'll give you some sample code. First of all, we start with our controller. And I just have a big circle here that says controller. And what happens is you'll hit a URL and it'll load a certain controller based on the URL. So if we had a URL that had /user in it, we would load a user controller. Okay? And by default, it'll load an index method, but we'll get into that shortly. The next thing you would do is load a view. So again, if you loaded a user controller, we would load a user view, and that's to display the web page. And these two tie together like that. The controller only talks to the view. The view is like the final outcome. It never talks back to the controller. The third part is the model, and this is where a lot of people get confused. The model is made for business logic, and when you think of business logic, what we're going to be doing is mostly database stuff, talking to MySql and different tables. So think of the model as where your access point is for talking to the database. And the way the model works is the controller, once a URL hits the controller, which is step one, optionally, if you want to get data from the database, let's say a user list, you'd hit the user controller, and then you'd hit the user model, and you'd send that data back to the controller, and then the controller would pass the data into the view. This might look like a lot of steps, but you have to realize view is pretty much HTML code. Controller is like the middleman, and model is all your database logic. So you're separating all your code into different components. It'll help if you look at this like a file structure. We have three folders: controller, model, and view. And inside of these folders, we have three files dedicated to one layout. The first controller is user. The second model is user model. And the third view is the user view. And these would all tie together depending on how you program it. I think it'll make a little more sense if I show you some actual code. So let's load that up. Right here, what we have in the blue box is a URL working on a local host. And this is just the structure of it. We have a controller and a method. So the controller is the actual class name. And you notice how this is a capital C. You should always give your class names a capital letter. And then the method in the URL goes to the method. And in here is where you would handle all your logic. I will say this, you can also pass additional parameters in here. So if you were to do /param, you could just put it in here and say param. And you could do whatever you would like with that. So that's the first example. Let's look at a better one. Here's one that loads the home page. Now I included /index just so that you can see it. By default, Codeigniter will load index if you don't provide it. So you don't always have to provide a method. I'll just leave it here though. So we're loading the home controller. We load the class home. And then it's the index method. So index. And in this one, we're loading a view. And this is the actual code to load a view in Codeigniter. This load view, and then the name of the view. In this case, it's home. And that's pretty simple. And for the third and final example, this one's with a parameter and a model. Might look a little scary at first, but let's break it down. We load the user controller, so we have class user. We go to the method view, so we go to the view, and we're passing a parameter of 1. This would be like if we wanted to look at an individual's profile. And we have the ID right here. So the first thing we have to do, since we're saving our records in the database, is access the database, and we do that with a model. So I use this load model, user model. What that does is it makes the user model accessible to the controller with the this keyword. And what I did was I did this user model get and then the ID. And that's just an example call. We would actually have to write out the model code. I assigned what would be a return value to the data variable, and then we load a view, the user view, and we pass in data. So now all that database information about this user that came from the model can now be accessed within the HTML view. And with this little bit of code, we can have things super clean. I should say that you're not limited to one method per class, by the way. You don't just have to have view. You could have hundreds in here if you wanted. But that's the gist of all of this. I think it's all going to make a lot more sense once you start developing the application. So let's get to it. Alright, it's time to download Codeigniter and get our project set up. First thing to do is head over to ellislab.com/Codeigniter, or you could just look on Google for Codeigniter and it'll be one of the first results to come out. What we're going to go ahead and do is just download the framework. Just click download, and the version I'm using is 2.1.3, as you can see in the download. After this series you might get a little bit later versions with minor revisions, but the base of it's not going to change. What you learn here you should be able to continually apply in later versions. So I'll go ahead and open my zip file, and we have Codeigniter and the version. And if I go in here, I have 3 folders and then my index file. So our first job is this. Let's go to the place where you set up your workspace for your local host. Mine happens to be C Drive Workspace, and I created a folder called Junior Dash. That's what I'm going to call the project for this series. You don't have to call it that, but I'm going to do that because what we're going to build is an application that's like a miniature dashboard for users. So with this folder, I'm just going to take all this stuff and copy it in there. It's literally this easy, drag and drop to install. Codeigniter is very nice. And I'll close out my zip file. Now my actual working PHP directory is this. I do use my host on port 82. Yours might look like localhost and then your file name. But I'll refresh, and you should have this up and running pretty easily. So let's briefly go through the structure of the application. We have a user guide, and the user guide is all HTML content. I could just drag this into here, and this content is the exact same content that's on the website. If you were to go to ellislab.com/Codeigniter, you could scroll down to the CI user guide, and they have this table of contents. Now don't be intimidated by all this stuff. I'm going to break it down for you so that you can get the most out of what you're going to use most often. A lot of these things we might not even use. So since that's already available online and most people have an internet connection all the time, you can just delete the user guide folder because it adds a lot of extra space. Next we have our system folder. This folder you never touch. This is the actual core of Codeigniter, so just disregard that. All of our work happens in this application folder. So if I go in here, this is where all my code's going to go. And there's actually a lot of folders in here that we're not even going to use. So even though it looks like there's a lot of stuff, it's not as bad as you think. So let me go back. And what we have here is welcome to Codeigniter. And if you have this, you've successfully installed it, and we're about good to go. The 3 folders we're going to keep our eye out on are controllers, views, models. Remember how we talked about that before? These are our main controllers, and this is how we're going to build our application. That'll sum it up for the installation. If you have any problems, feel free to ask a question. Since we got our project started, we now have the option to choose how we want to work with it. And my favorite editor is NetBeans. You might prefer Eclipse or some alternative, maybe even Sublime Text. But I prefer NetBeans just because I think it's really easy to use. So this is optional. If you do want to use NetBeans, what you can do is just go to netbeans.org, go to your download section, and we really only need the PHP one. So it's 53 megabytes. You would need the Java runtime environment to run this, and a lot of people say Java runs really slow, but I find that not very true with NetBeans. I think it's a very solid IDE, and you really can't go wrong with the code completion, the code hinting, and the error checking. and the navigation. It's just extremely useful. So I'll go ahead and close this, and I'm going to be doing the project in NetBeans. So here's just a bare bones NetBeans, and what I'm going to do is click this new button to create a new project. And I will say your icons might be small, so I'll right click, and you see this little thing that says small toolbar icons. It might look like that. I just like mine bigger. So I'll click new project and create a PHP project with existing source. Next, and then choose the sources folder, and I'm going to choose Junior Dash. That's our project we're making. And the PHP version, it says PHP is only used for hints. And I'm going to use 5.4 since I pretty much use that all the time now. I'll just press finish. Now, one thing about IDEs and code things like this that scare me is code that it adds. And NetBeans is pretty good about this. I'll go ahead and show you. Let me go to my workspace folder and Junior Dash. It created this folder called NB Project. Now all this does is reference NetBeans so that it displays in this panel here a certain way with any options you might have. But this is not a requirement. If I delete this, it won't break our applications in the future or anything. You also don't have to place the folder inside your application path. So whether you have this here or not, it doesn't matter. And now we have a NetBeans project, and it opens our index file for us. And the place we're going to be working is application, so I'll just open that up. You can ignore the include path. You can ignore the system folder. And that's pretty much it for NetBeans. If you choose to use it, again, that's your choice. You can use any editor you want. In this video, we're going to talk about htaccess and mod rewrite to make pretty URLs, and also the development modes. First thing is, you might not realize this, but this is actually not mod rewritten, so your URLs would be index.php/welcome, and that's your default controller, just welcome when you first install it. But if we were to make another method in here, it would always have index.php in front of it, and that's really ugly. So what we want to do is create an htaccess file. So I'll just right click source files, new, empty file. And by the way, let me show you something. If you are using NetBeans, if you click new and you don't see empty file here, you can just go to other, and I'll go to the other folder, and it'll populate a list of the things you most recently create. So an empty file, and that's what I was doing. So htaccess, finish, and you're going to need mod rewrite enabled in Apache. That's mod rewrite. It's probably really hard to read with that font color. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste in a chunk of code. Basically all this does is reroute our system so that it has nice URLs and doesn't access the wrong area. I'm going to put this in a note attached to this video so that you can download this exact code and paste it in here. Now I will mention this, and this is very important, where it says rewrite base. Since we're working in a subfolder, see this Junior Dash, we're going to want to make sure that we put Junior Dash in there, or whatever your project name is. So I'll put Junior Dash. That way we don't go below the directory route when we rewrite URLs. And to test if it works, you can just get rid of index.php and just try /welcome. And did I save that? Yes, I did. Also, make sure you double check that your htaccess is down here. It looks like I forgot one step, and that's in the config file. If I go to the config folder and then config, and you scroll down a little ways, it says index page. By default, we have index.php. We have to remove this. Then it'll just use nothing. And if we go back, let's try again. Let me refresh. There we go. We have it working. And for fun, let's try a test method. I'm going to go to my controllers. And if it feels like we're kind of jumping around right now, don't worry. We're going to go over these slower. So right below here, the index method inside the welcome controller, let's just say public function test, and I'll just echo out 1. So I'll type /test after the word welcome, and we have 1. So now I know my mod rewrite is working. So if you have any issues with this, go ahead and ask a question, because sometimes this is a little tricky to get started. And that about sums it up for the mod rewrite. The other one thing I want to touch on is the development mode. In the index.php file, if you open this, we have an environment. And what you can do is change this from development to production. And all it really does is turn off your error reporting. It's not something I really use or care for, because on a production server you usually have errors off by default in PHP. But I thought I'd bring it up briefly so that you know about it.